There really aren't any archetypes in Forcible that have the same level of history as vampires. These guys go as far back as Valhalla Block, something even fairy tales can't claim to have. Vampires are also one of my favorite archetypes. The Grim Cluster vampires had some of the most interesting effects and cards for support, even if they weren't the best. Alucard, their in-archetype ruler, also has one of the few unique, non-well related judgment abilities, and he's also one of the earliest forms of imperishable in the cluster. You'd think vampires would actually be pretty good as an archetype since they've been in every cluster, but they're actually pretty fringe in terms of usefulness, at least compared to the other bullshit in the game. Darkness is all about hand and field destruction, and after Grim Cluster, vampires really didn't facilitate that strategy. When they had their reintroduction in Lapis, they were all about making use of 1/1 counters to slowly boost themselves, or spending those counters to gain various effects. For the most part, they were just too slow, and there were better cards you could be using for their price. Their base stats weren't high enough in Alice Lapis Frontiers to deal with the myriad of destruction and damage spells that could easily remove them at the time. A lot has happened in a year, though, and a large chunk of the stronger Darkness cards have rotated out. I don't necessarily think vampires are in a league with Prissy or Fox, but they can be a pretty decent rogue deck when piloted properly. That aside, let's get into it. Here's the example deck list. Alright, first let's take a look at our ruler, Reiya, fourth daughter of the Mikage. She's a vampire with the ability to generate mystery counters. She also has her little wingdings, which I assume will be revealed when the planets align or some other shit. She flips over for 2 darkness and a void into a 12/12 flyer that gains 3 mystery counters on enter. She can also rest herself to remove a mystery counter to destroy a Resonator, and of course she has wingdings, but hold on. This wingdings is different from the wingdings on the other side. I don't understand why we can't just know what this is. Reiya is actually a pretty strong J-ruler. She has a decent stat line for her cost, and the mystery counter mechanic she uses can give her an extra edge over other darkness rulers. The fact that she's a vampire on both sides is pretty important too, and is something we'll get into a little later. There really isn't much else to her though. She's mostly going to be an extra beat stick the deck can use mid to late game, and we'll be running enough things to boost her to make sure she swings in for a decent amount. Now on to the Resonators. Vampires really don't have many good options between Lapis and Reiya cluster, unfortunately. Despite the large amount of these guys, most of them either lack decent effects or have their effects locked behind too high of a cost. You see, there's not really any synergy between vampires despite them being in every cluster. It's like the design team would rather reinvent the wheel each time instead of just trying to build on more of what's already working, but I digress. Our first Resonator is Shara, third daughter of the Mikage. Shara is a 5/5 1-cost Resonator with the effect that she cannot attack unless she has a 1/1 counter on herself. She can also pay 2 darkness and 1 void will to do 200 damage to a Resonator and gain a 1/1 counter. Okay, so Shara's not that great. She's interesting on the play since she has a decently sized body, but she still dies to the most common 1-cost removal spells. She technically scales as long as you can get counters on her, but her ability is way too costly for what it does. She's mostly in here to supplement the few cards that we'll be using that benefit from having vampires on the field, of which we have exactly 2. I say run her at 4. She's the best 1-cost vampire in New Frontiers right now. The first 2-cost vampire we run is Rinka, second daughter of the Mikage. Much like Shara, Rinka also has gimmicks that play around with 1/1 counters, but she's not restricted from attack without them. Instead, she gains a counter every time she deals damage, and can also gain precision as long as there is a counter on her. She can then remove a counter to give herself flying till the end of turn. She's a 6/6 body for her cost, but her effect is a little on the slow side. I still think she's a pretty good card despite this. The obvious way to pump her is through battle, but you can also use cards like Dino Rush to help her build up damage without risking her taking any in return. Rinka is a solid 2-cost vampire, so run her at 2 or 3 copies. The last vampire worth talking about in the deck is Secret Messenger of the Mikage. She's a 3-cost 7/7 that does 400 damage to a Resonator for each vampire you control. She also removes any Resonator she does damage to from the game if it would go to the graveyard. She seems like a pretty mediocre card, but she's actually kind of strong when combined with Reiya. Messenger's damage gets boosted to base of 800 since Reiya is a vampire, and if you have a Shara or Rinka on board as well, it's boosted to 1200. Messenger isn't your boss monster, but she can certainly be one of your big playmakers. Run her at 3 since you want to see her a lot, but not so much that she gets cloggy. There are of course more vampires you can throw in, and if you choose to do so, that's all up to you. The Mikage sisters are pretty versatile, but they lack any offensive power. They help remove a lot of 1-cost cards, but are very susceptible to a lot of basic destruction spells. Transforming Vampire isn't a bad choice either if you choose to run Dino Rush with Rinka, since he can also benefit from it as well. His life drain ability has the same requirements as Rinka's counter generation. Vingolf Dracula is also a decent tech card if you plan to build around using Reiya to end games. He's a high-cost Resonator though, and there's plenty of better options you could use than him when it comes to things you can splash in. A lot of your non-engine Resonators are going to be staple Darkness cards. Since these are super common cards, I'm just going to quickly run down the list. Force Shade is absolutely required as he allows you to run cards that damage you for costs like Final Battle, Heteroclite Excalibur, and Blood Spray. Abdul and Rizard are common counter cards that work well depending on what you're up against. If you expect to see Fox or other graveyard-reliant decks, then run a couple of Rizard main and side Abdul. If not, just swap them around. Since the deck's primary colors are black and red, we can run some of Lapis' support cards from Return of the Dragon Emperor, namely Blazer Dragon and Valentina. Both of these cards synergize well with Messenger since she can fuel their effects. The chant lineup strays a bit from Darkness control. We're running Resonators, so while forcing things out of our opponent's hand is cool, we really want to capitalize on making our creatures as big as possible. One of the most important spells in the deck is Nameless Mist. Not only does it force a non-Resonator card out of your opponent's hand, but it also gives a counter to Shara or Rinka to make use of their effects. Run it at 4. Absolutely no question. The next big chant is Power Absorption. This is a 2-cost chant from the Lapis starter decks, and it deals 600 damage to a target J-Resonator at instant speed, and then an additional 100 for each Vampire Resonator you control. After that, you put a 1/1 counter on every Vampire you control. Since it doesn't state that each Vampire has to be a Resonator, this means that Reiya can gain counters too, even if she can't use them on her ruler side. When you do cast Judgment with her, she keeps the counters, so hopefully you end up flipping her when she has a few counters on her already to make her that much harder to kill. This card is also a great answer to problem Resonators like Abdul and other pesky 2 costs, so run it at 4. Reiya's mystery counter support is pretty strong, especially since it's not too hard to get counters on her through her stone by casting Judgment or just using her ruler side effect. You can mix and match if you want, but I generally found Sword of the New Moon and Blood Spray to be the best cards for the deck. New Moon helps because this is an early to mid-game deck, and being able to remove your opponent's smaller Resonators early on can help you get an extra damage. It also does a pretty decent job of removing mid-game threats for 1 mystery counter. Blood Spray is a stupid powerful card, even without its extra mystery cost. Draw power is very strong, especially in Darkness, which is supposed to be a color that typically goes negative on hand count to make your opponent go negative even more. In mid-game, Blood Spray serves as a great way to draw into those extra destruction and discard spells, and also gives you a non-quick cast destruction ability that gets around cards like Freyr's Spell. Keep both of these cards at around 3 or 4 each. Typically you don't need that much field destruction, but it differs depending on what you're playing against. You can splash whatever you want for the remaining spots in the deck. I threw in some copies of Castlevania and Fated Reunion to help with consistency, as well as another way to boost Reiya up when she flips. You can run some other Darkness staples too, such as Final Battle, Dark Knight Butterfly, or Endless Night. Red also has some decent splash cards, namely Flame Horse, who can make Reiya into a scary 14/14 swiftness flyer on the turn she flips over. Other good red options are burn cards like Lightning Strike or Blood Boil that can help you close out games or come as added removal for Resonators. I already talked about this one earlier, but Dino Rush is a decent splash depending on what your goal is. I personally find it a little slow, but it does work well with Rinka, as well as the 2 Ancient Knights vampires that can help gain life when they do damage. The problem with red and black is that they lack addition removal, and Zero Circle of Protection will straight up ruin your day. I actually recommend splashing white in as a color because it gives you access to some pretty good cards you would otherwise be unable to use. Manifestation of Power is great addition removal, but can also double as a way to recover Rinka or Valentina to let them swing again. Lumia's Judgment is a very cost-efficient removal spell that can get a decent board wipe going. The only problem is that it'll most likely clear your field too. You can also run Purification, but I try to stay away from cards that cost more than 1 light will unless you plan to hard commit into those colors. Keep in mind that white also gives you access to the E&W Lapis Resonator, which lets you cut down on your 1-cost chance. This deck also has a somewhat decent amount of Will of Despair in it, so he can reach a somewhat respectable attack and defense line without much issue. White is an amazing color when mixed with red or black, and we luck out in having it answer a lot of the problems the deck can't address otherwise. Your side deck will mostly consist of whatever situational cards you skipped over in main. In particular, you should have Endless Night in there if you passed on it, since it provides a great board wipe for elf decks and a cheap response to large Resonators like Griffin. Neo Barrier helps too and stops a lot of ramp decks from doing anything. And lastly, as I already stated, a few burn cards can go a long way in certain matchups, and even a Blood Boil or 2 can make Rinka into a strong finisher if you find yourself needing extra reach against your opponent. Overall, I think vampires have a lot of potential. I really wish Reiya and her support kept the 1/1 counter theme to mesh well with existing cards, but they have a few things going for them. Most notably is that there's an actual reason to run vampire tribal cards like Power Absorption and Messenger, which are both very underwhelming before the fourth daughter came out. Hopefully the coming sets will release some more tribal support rather than just pure mystery counter support, and vampires can start to shine again, as they almost did during Grim Cluster. So, thanks for sticking around. I know I update pretty slowly, and I apologize for that. I'm pretty much just one guy doing this on the side of 2 other jobs, so my free time gets a little constrained. I do plan to release at least one more deck list this month though, so I'll end this video with a little bit of a teaser for that.